The river, between worlds. I first felt the river before I saw it. A slow hush beneath the ribs, an undertow moving through the bones, as if my marrow had learned the language of water and wanted to speak it back. Somewhere a heart monitor tried to count me. Somewhere hands pressed heat into my cooling wrists. Somewhere a name was being called as if a name could be a rope. But under all that, the hush, the long syllable of a current that had already memorized my footsteps and was merely waiting for me to follow. When the light thinned into a softer dusk that was neither evening nor dawn, the room unstitched at the corners and folded away. The air grew wide and blue. I was standing on silt, the color of unlit rain. The river opening left and right like a road without maps. Reeds moved their thin green spines, as though scratching the sky. Moths drifted like ash that had forgotten to fall. On the far bank, which was not far, a line of pale stones seemed to breathe very slowly. I did not call out. It seemed rude to speak loudly where time was resting. The hush made its own introductions. If a border must exist, it should know how to whisper. I walked to the edge, and kneeling in my two shadows, I touched the surface. It was cool as an old prayer, and it carried back a pulse that was not mine, but recognized me anyway. A small boat nosed the reed bed, as if it had been listening for my hands. There was no oar. There was a cord. There was a bell the size of a thimble tied to the cord with black thread. I looked down the slow length of water and saw a figure at the path's bend, where willow branches held the dusk in their nets. He did not hurry. I felt no need for haste either. He wore nothing that could be counted as a uniform. No cloak, no hood, no medal at his throat. If he had a name, it was behind his eyes, not on his mouth. He came and stood on the bank, where my footprints were just beginning to fill with light. He did not look like a myth. He looked like someone who had been awake for a very long time, and no longer minded it. He raised one hand, not in greeting, but in consent, as if to allow my being here to continue. Then he nodded at the bell. "This is a crossing place," I said without saying it, because the words never quite left my lips, and yet were understood. He inclined his head. "The bell is the courtesy." His gaze replied. "Water prefers to know what is coming." I waited for him to name a price. I thought of coins, of lips placed on eyelids, of currencies whose weight is grief. He did not extend a palm. He extended his listening. I felt the shape of it gather around me like a room. "Most who come here bring a story," his listening said. "They offer it, and water remembers the path they have taken." "Do I give you my story?" I asked without asking, "or the story of someone I loved?" He looked at the river. "Either opens the door," his silence replied, "but the door you choose becomes the house you enter." I thought of an afternoon warm enough to wear as a shirt, my mother's hand making a lantern of mine, a field that had the decency to be endless until supper. But even as that door opened, I realized the house beyond it would keep me in the living world, and the river was singing another key, a lower one, like the left hand of a piano, when the window is open and rain is almost here. "Show me what this river is," I said, and the bell made one small, clear sound, as if it had been waiting to agree. He placed his palm on my shoulder, as someone might place it on a sleeping dog to tell it there would be no thunder. Then he stepped aside, and I understood the permission. If a road keeps its promise, it will walk with you, even when you are the one moving. So I walked north, which felt like south, the path curving with the water, as a ribbon curves with hair. The reeds thinned. The moths grew more careful. On the bank, the pale stones with breath in them were carved, each with a tiny mark, a notch, a letter that might have been an alphabet of wind. My shoes left no sound, and yet there was the soft reply of the soil to each lifting of my heel. Across the river, a field lay quiet, with the carefulness of an animal that has just been born. The first person I met did not stand. He was sitting where the bank leveled into a cove of clay, worn smooth by knees. He kept his feet bare as if the ground were a kind of prayer rug, and he didn't want to speak with shoes. His hair was the color of silt when silt dries. His hands were warm with old rope burns and the quiet that comes after many nights of the same weather. Beside him was a lantern that did not need flame. It glowed with a borrowed light, lit as bee honey is lit from inside. He saw me, and his face was the transparency of water that has learned not to lie. He lifted the lantern and placed it on the water, not in, and the water held it the way a friend holds a confidence. The glow drifted 5 feet and then stopped, as if a leash of current reached that far and no farther. I kept the light, he said, with a voice that did not trouble the dusk. And then I lost her. Some things are faithful until they learn what they must keep, and then the faithfulness remakes itself into absence. I kept the light, so the sea took my wife. He stroked the air above the lantern as if petting a dog. I learned to be a lighthouse, he said, and to pretend I had become stone. When the storms came, I lifted the beam and scribbled on the water until the boats found the alphabet and lived. But the one night the beam would not behave. I thought it was the weather, and the weather thought it was me, and the water thought it was its own mind. And by the time the language agreed again, she had gone out to call me in, and the beam made our house a glass above the waves, and the wind turned the glass to knives. They found her with fish in her hair, and a look that forgave me before I asked it to. He lifted the lantern with 2 fingers, and for a moment, I saw the rounded shape of a ring at the bottom of the glow. He smiled at my seeing. I kept the light, because I did not want the water to forget her, he said, and the water kept reminding me of the light. This was our arrangement for years that were not years. The boats came through like prayers properly addressed. My roof rebuilt itself in my sleep. The sea lost interest in deciding, and then one morning, I realized the light was not ours. It had never been ours. It had been borrowed from the part of the sky that stands up when someone is dying, and I took it down and kissed it and set it on the water, as I did for you. And I said to the sea that it could keep what belonged to it, and I would keep what belonged to me, and neither of us would pretend to own the other's breath. The sea let me live after that. The sea grew less vain. The sea stopped rehearsing my grief to me. That is all I needed to cross. But I stayed because telling it is another kind of crossing. And when I tell it, the lantern brightens as if a small sun has decided to begin again. He pushed the light, and it drifted 6 feet this time. He laughed softly. The river has learned something, he said. Or perhaps I have. He handed me nothing. And yet I felt the weight of something in my palm, as if a lesson had a coin inside it. I thanked him without words and continued. The reeds returned and then were gone again. The bank sloped and flattened in the way of lullabies. Once a heron watched me with the suspicion of a guardian who has seen too many thieves. Once the wind shuddered like a curtain when a storm decides to try another town. I passed a willow whose branches were weighted with bells, little ones, not unlike the thimble on my boat's cord. They did not ring. They breathed. The breathing sounded like names being pronounced by someone with no tongue. The second person was not a person alone. Around her were small chairs, the sort that expect to be waited upon by children. They faced every direction, as if the lesson were to sit and learn the sky from all its angles. A cradle hung from the willow, and in it lay a blanket that remembered weight. She stood not tall but definite. Her hands were strong, with having held wrists during storms of pain, with having tied hair back from hot temples, with having counted breaths that came as if they had forgotten how to line up. She watched me the way a midwife watches a door. Behind her the river widened, and the bank where she kept her vigil curved inward like a palm. I have walked many thresholds, she said, and I have learned that some doors open into rooms that are not meant to be furnished. When I was young, I carried life from one shore to another. I loaned my hands to the first cry. I taught fathers how to kneel without falling. I rinsed the morning off new faces and told them who they were. Later, my hands learned the other weight. I carried silence from one shore to another. I loaned my ears to the last words. I taught sons how to say go without leaving. I rinsed the hours off old faces and told them they were still beautiful. She turned toward the chairs. These are for stories that forgot they were born, she said. and they sit until they remember. Sometimes I hear them humming. Sometimes they only breathe when they learn their names again. The bells above us ring without ringing, and the river lifts one finger and writes on itself for a long time. She pointed at the cradle. There are words that cannot find tongues, she said, so they become winds. When the winds return, they carry a taste of salt and sun, as if they have been to the sea to study. I never argue with them. If you argue with wind, you must be prepared to become a tree. For a while we stood together without counting. She placed her palm on the bank, as a priest might place it on a book. "Keep this in your blood," she said without command. "Every crossing is a birth. Every birth is a crossing. The task is to learn which way the river is moving when it moves through you." She turned, and the cradle quieted even more, which I had not known was possible. Her mouth read a litany without motion. I recognized a few names and did not ask from where. Before I left, she reached into the river and brought up a small stone, the color of first milk. It was oval and smooth and lighter than it looked. She set it in my pocket, with the tender seriousness reserved for first teeth and last letters. "Carry one thing that remembers both shores," she said, "and it will teach your bones what not to fear." I walked again. The path no longer seemed to be beside the river, but part of the river's suggestion, a sentence not yet punctuated. My footsteps learned to be commas. Once I felt the tug of something behind my ribs, and thought of a hospital room, where a person who had my face lay resting, with a machine's steady hunger for data. The tug passed. The hush returned. The hush taught me patience by refusing to hurry, even when I wanted to either run or repent. On the far bank, farther now, stood a city made of damp memories. Its roofs were the color of unripe plums. No smoke rose from chimneys, because the chimneys were asleep. And when chimneys sleep, they dream of the work of swallows. The river widened further until it seemed a small lake that had not yet decided to be one. I wondered whether the boats that drifted here knew about storms, or whether they had learned another weather, in which decisions are softer, and angers do not sharpen. I came upon a man holding a drum. It was not a war drum. It was the kind used for keeping time with the way a hand learns a song faster than a mouth does. He sat with his knees open to the river, and his eyes closed as if measuring how far the inside of a heart extends when it is not afraid. The drum was not loud, and he did not strike it. He placed his palm on the skin and let the pulse from the ground come into it. The sound was faint, the way a candle might sound if it had a voice. He opened his eyes. "I was asked to beat men into marching," he said, "when my body was still quicker than my conscience. I was asked to make the road under their feet remember only one direction, and that direction was away. Away from their names, away from their small sleeping children, away from the woman who filed her hope like her nails, away from the porch, where quiet was already waiting to be a refuge. I was asked to make my hands a weapon with no shrapnel, and I did, and they marched. And the road forgot how to be a place where people could turn around without explanation." He lifted the drum and looked at its skin as if reading a wound. "The night before my last march, I dreamed of the river," he said, though I had not yet seen it. "I dreamed it was full of shoes, not floating, not sinking, what the water does with grief when it becomes meticulous. I woke and knew I could not beat them into leaving anymore. A drum can be a boundary. A drum can also be a bridge. I stood at the gate, and I beat a rhythm of return, and some men understood, and they took off their packs, and they unlearned their orders faster than I could breathe, and I helped them put their names back on like shirts, and they went home the long way, but home has no short way anyway." He smiled with one side of his mouth, the side that forgives. "They took my drum," he said, "and they took my nights, and they took my boots, and they put me in a room where the air had to rehearse before it entered, and still got the lines wrong. But I had already beaten the return into the road." It remembered. The people walked back to each other. The war grew embarrassed for a moment, and looked down. The room where they kept me was a kind of oven, but I learned to bake there the bread of unwitnessed mercy. After a while, they let me leave, because I had become no one they could use. I came to the river because it had been faithful to my dream. Now I sit and let the ground teach my drum the old rhythms of leaving that are also arriving. He placed the drum in my hands, and I heard nothing. But the skin was warm with a song I had not yet learned and already trusted. Keep a cadence of mercy, he said. When people cannot hear the way home, beat the return into your hours until they do. The river loves that tempo. I wanted to ask him how many left and how many returned, but numbers have an arrogance here I couldn't feed. Instead, I pressed the drum to my chest for a moment, like a child does with a book he cannot yet read, but knows will be his. Then I passed it back and I walked on. Evening became its own country, and then it did not. On my right, the bank rose into a bluff of shale that cracked in useful places, where lizards might ruin the dignity of sermons. On my left, a field of cattails listened to something only they could hear, and nodded grimly as though it were good news disguised as work. The bells in the willow I had left behind began to breathe more audibly. If breath can be counted when it never went to school, they were counting. I reached a place where the river narrowed, as if coming to terms with itself. The current made a sound like a promise being edited. In an eddy close to the bank lay a small city that was not small at all once you looked longer. Spires like fingers learning prayer, windows dark with the tiredness of having been eyes for too long, steps leading down into green that had not been grass for years. A woman stood with a coil of rope over her shoulder and a flashlight that did not need batteries. Her suit was a skin of salt. She was very tired in the way that makes people honest. They flooded us for the sake of a dam, she said, and called it progress. The river made itself a map over our roofs, and I learned to read underwater. I was a diver then. I still am, I suppose. I went down to the old streets as if visiting a graveyard where the dead had decided to keep their furniture. I opened cupboards and found cups that had been waiting with frayed patience. I found a music box and turned its wet key, and the river hummed a sound like a song about a song. I brought up what I could and tagged the rest in my memory with ribbons of current and light. Some nights I slept on a raft above what used to be my bedroom, and told the fish their ancestors had the good sense to be able to breathe air. She knelt and drew a square in the silt with her finger. Here, she said, was the bakery where they knew how to forgive small debts with generous bread. Here the barber who kept everyone the age they wanted to be. Here the alley where cats taught children about reincarnation. Here the one door no one used because it was too beautiful. When the water came, it did not ask for papers. It did not make a speech. It set its shoulder to us, and we yielded because there was nothing else to do that would not grow cruel in a hurry. I went down again and again with my rope and my stubborn breath, and I tied what I loved to the years so tightly that even when the city was gone, I could still walk its streets with dry eyes if I remembered to hum. She uncoiled the rope and held one end out to me. "Tie one knot now," she said, "over any memory you are afraid will drown." I thought of a house where someone waited with soup warm enough to fix the worst kinds of loneliness. I tied a knot for the way her wrist smelled when she stirred. I tied a knot for the beaded curtain that made every arrival a ceremony. I tied a knot for the mug with a chip that made every mouth a little braver. The rope accepted each thought with the focus of a craftsman. "If you return," she said, "you will need these. Do not mistake forgetting for survival. The river does not. It remembers us so accurately we must forgive it or go mad." She placed a piece of blue glass in my hand. It had once been a bottle, then a shard, then a sorrow. And now it had the worn kindness of the sky held in a palm. "When you place this on a windowsill," she said, "you will be seen by the other side of light." I walked, and the path became a sentence finishing itself. From the willow's bells a first ring arrived, very faint, as if a name had agreed to be spoken. I did not know if the name was mine. I did not ask. I have learned not to interrogate rescues. The ferryman appeared again, this time without having to perform a rival. He was simply there, as fatigue is there after forgiveness. The small boat that had nosed the reeds when I began sat on the silt, as if it had been waiting to pretend it had weight. He examined my pockets with a seeing that did not require eyes. He noticed the pale stone. He noticed the blue glass. He noticed the knots I carried, though they were only in my hands when I remembered them. He did not smile. He did not need to. The river had begun to. "You have heard enough to cross," his listening said, "or you have heard enough to return. The river does not mind which. Water travels in both directions at once when it is large enough to keep secrets." I looked across. The far bank seemed no farther. The pale stones with their tiny alphabets of wind lifted and resettled with the carefulness of very old birds. A figure on the other shore turned slightly, and in that small motion there was all the weight of a welcome someone is afraid to speak. "If I cross," I said to the quiet between us, "do I stop telling? Do I stop needing language? Do I become something that cannot be recorded except as weather?" He gestured with the bell at my ankle. "The courtesy remains," his silence replied. "But the instruments change. Over there, stories are not told. They are sung by what you touch. They are braided into the way you place your foot on the ground. They are inhaled rather than said." I thought of a hospital room, whose windows had their own pulse, of the people who had decided to hold me to this shore, with cords and named bottles, and the arithmetic of care. I thought of the midwife, who had told me every crossing is a birth, and every birth is a crossing. I thought of the drummer, who had taught the road to remember home. I thought of the diver with a city in her lungs, and the rope knotted for memory. I thought of the lighthouse keeper, who had learned to let light belong to light. I thought of the willow whose bells breathed names. I knelt and placed the blue glass in the silt, so that river and sky could learn each other more thoroughly. I took the pale stone from my pocket and pressed it to the inside of my wrist until it warmed. I placed the knots in my mouth as if they were small loaves that could keep me through a winter of doubt. Then I stood and stepped back from the boat. "I will return," I said in the grammar of this shore, which is to say I did not speak, but the decision grew tall and had a face. "I will carry these stories to the side where forgetting is a profession and ask it to resign. I will build a bridge out of sentences wide enough for an old grief to push its cart across without catching a wheel. I will ring a bell when I begin, so water knows it is not being ambushed by our need. I will teach my hours to keep the cadence of mercy. I will place blue glass on the window so the other side of light can see where to stand. I will ask those who listen to bring their own stones and to warm them, and to make pockets of courage they can slip their hands into when the sky wrongly predicts. I will tell the truth, which is that I have never been alone and never will be. Not because I am brave, but because the river cannot bear a solitary current for long. The ferryman's gaze considered me as one considers a good door that has been well cared for and swings without complaint. He reached and touched my shoulder again. His hand had the gravity of bread. The boat slid backwards without being pushed and rested its small mouth against the reeds. The bell made a note like a coin struck gently and offered not to be kept. When I turned to go, the path did not begin. It did not need to. It was everywhere under me as water is everywhere under the surface of a lake. I counted my steps without numbers. I carried the hush in my chest, like a candle that has forgotten how to go out. Behind me, the willow's bells made a breathing that accepted me. The river stitched itself closed in the slow manner of mending that never quite hides the seam and never wants to. There was a room. There was a machine that had learned the shape of patience. There were hands that had permission to be tired. There was a window and a thin curtain ignoring a breeze. There was my name. That rope being pulled into the mouth of my chest by someone who had kept vigil without coffee. I opened my eyes in the way a house opens all its doors at once after a storm. The room said hello by continuing to exist. I do not remember speaking, but I remember the first things I found. I asked for a small stone, smooth enough to teach my wrist a river's grammar. I asked for a piece of blue glass. I tied knots in the air with my hands and placed them in the drawer beside the bed. I could not explain. No one asked me to. The courtesy remained. In the weeks that learned to be months, I visited water when I could. Lakes that had moderated their ambitions. Streams that rushed as if appointed and late. A basin where the sun rehearsed its exit. I sat and listened. And sometimes the hush replied, and sometimes it pretended to be wind. When the bells of the willow in my memory breathed names, I wrote them down. When I could not write them down, I breathed them back, which is a kind of ink you carry in your lungs when pens fail. I began to tell. Telling was not a choice. It was an instrument the other side needed me to learn. I told of the man who kept a light until it kept him, and how he let it go, so the sea could remember its own face. I told of the woman who carried entrances and exits in the same hands, and never once confused their doors. I told of the drummer who taught the road home, and of the city that became a lake, and of the diver who returned with blue to lend windows their right to be eyes. I told of the willow that breathed names, and the bells that ring without ringing, and of a boat that waits without waiting, and of a ferryman who is not a collector of coins, but of pausings. Telling opened other rooms. People came with their pockets turned out. They offered rings that had outlived vows and names that had slipped their leashes and photographs that were really weather reports for days no one could repair. They placed them on the table, the way one places bread that is not yet sliced. They said, "Keep what you must," and I did not keep them. I let them learn the river. I learned to tie knots for anyone who needed to return with something more honest than forgetting. I learned to hold a drum to the ground and let the earth write the tempo. I learned to keep blue glass where the sun could find it slowly. I learned to place the stone on my wrist before sleep and listen for bells that breathe. There were nights when the room felt near full of water, and I thought death had left the window ajar. The hush would remind me that water is not an intruder here. It lives in what we are made of. It becomes impatient only when we pretend to live without crossing. I would sit up and name the names I could bear, and the names I could not, and the bells would breathe, and the river would remain a river. Sometimes I dream the midwife sets a chair for me, and I sit and watch my own story remember it was born. Sometimes the lighthouse keeper sends his lantern across a floor, and it pauses as if deciding which syllable to emphasize. Sometimes the drummer counts with his fingers on my ribs, and the road adjusts itself under my childhood, and I am returned to the house of soup and beaded curtain and the chipped mug, and I do not weep, or if I do not apologize. Sometimes the diver says follow, and we descend through water that has already forgiven us, and the old bakery is there with its debts and its bread, and the barber nods and keeps me the age I truly am, which is a weather between weathers, a dusk that knows its own name. The river is not singular. The river is a choir of water inheriting itself forever. Some days I hear other shores answer it, not only the one I walked, but 1,000 that resemble it the way siblings resemble each other when they are tired of the obvious. There is a desert that has learned to be a harbor. There is a mountain that writes its autobiography on snow, one flake at a time. There is a city that fell asleep during a festival and will not wake until the music finishes the story it began before any instruments were invented. The crossings multiply. The courtesies remain. I have a bell now. It is not the thimble tied to the cord of a small boat. It is the note my breath makes when it meets a story and recognizes itself. Before I begin, I let that note sound inside my chest. It is soft, and the room does not always notice, but the water does, and it reshapes itself around the telling as a garment does around a body returned from a long illness. When the last word comes, it does not end anything. It is only the place where the river turns, pretending to be the same water it was a moment ago. We are fooled for the length of a sigh, and then we remember we are not being fooled at all. This is how water is honest. If you come to listen, bring a stone. It should be small enough to ride your wrist and large enough to feel like a promise. Bring a piece of glass that has been touched by weather, blue if you can find it. Place them where you sleep. Tie a knot in a ribbon or a string or a strip of an old shirt to hold the shape of what you cannot afford to let drown. If you have a drum, even a small one, even a bowl you can turn over, set it on your knees and ask the floor what it remembers. Then learn to keep that cadence without apology. When you feel the hush, do not be afraid to give it your name. It will give it back more gently than you loaned it. Once, after a telling, I stepped outside, and the night had made itself so thin I could see through it to the other side of darkness, where morning is carved. A moth landed on my hand, and the dust of its wings was the same dust I had seen on the river when it decided not to be wind. I stood there and understood that this was prayer enough. To be the place two waters meet, and neither one need be ashamed. The river between worlds does not ask us to choose a shore and believe in it against the other. It asks us to learn the art of stepping without bruising the surface. It asks us to become courtesies. There will be other tellings. The lantern keeper does not run out of light. The midwife has chairs yet unoccupied. waiting for stories that forgot they were born. The drummer still hears how the ground laughs at orders and prefers songs. The submerged city has windows that wish to be eyes again, and a music box that has not played its best tune. The willow remembers more names than any census. The ferryman's hand remains bread. And when your day leans into that edge, where breath lengthens with a certain skill, when you feel the hush under the catalog of everything you thought you had to do, when the room folds a little at the corners, and the air grows wide enough to keep a river, take the stone and the glass and the knots and the drum of your ribs, and step to the water that has always been here. Let the bell inside you make its note. If the small boat noses the reeds, decide with the honesty you have earned. Cross or return. The river prefers either to pretending you do not know it. If you return, bring a story and place it on the table like bread warm enough to repair a winter. If you cross, sing by touching the world so carefully that everything around you becomes the song. I am still learning the ways to begin. Tonight, I will start here, with the lantern set upon the surface, and the light drifting 6 feet, and then stopping, and then drifting 7, and then stopping again, as if measuring what I have understood since the last time I had courage to tell. I will say there is a river. I will say it is real. I will say you have already been there. I will say your footsteps are commas, and your heart keeps the cadence, and your hands have learned to be boats when someone is drowning. I will say the bells breathe you, and the water knows your face, and none of this requires belief, because belief is only a door, and you are already in the room. And then I will listen to the hush to see if it agrees. If it does, we will go on, not toward an ending, but toward a turning, which is the kind of mercy the river has always preferred.